Okay. Good morning to everybody. Morning. And to those out in the internet land, we want you to as well. We're going to continue where we finished off in the kind of a preface to chapter 6. We had read verses 1 and 2 last week, and you might recall we had a discussion about who the sons of God and the daughters of men were. And it's a difficult passage. It's difficult in the Hebrew. It's difficult to understand. And so there's 3 theories that have kind of stood the test of time. There's adherence to each of them. And the author kind of believes that there's a combination of these 2 that's probably more likely. But you can definitely cannot dismiss this one. It is out there as well. So I'm not going to recover that ground today. But we are going to kind of use that as a beginning to talk about this whole subject. The fact that the sons of God took women for themselves as they chose, that's what the text says, may hint at the fact that these unions were not legitimate. There is no mention of their parents arranging marriages as would have been typical in the ancient times. They chose whomever they wanted and regarded it to be good without regard to what God and his parents regarded as good. The fact that they took them may indicate that the taking was by force, as we had said briefly last week. In this reading, the sons of God are thus misusing their power for sexual advantage and of forging relationships with those who do not share their heritage in godliness, which leads them away from God. So we said the text implied that the sons of God were from the line of Seth, which was good. And we read that whole genealogy in Genesis 5. Sethians, if I can coin that word, the Sethians were the good ones. Cain, his descendants were up to no good. So the thought was the daughters of men came from that. There's a lot of theories and lots of supposition. Your mileage may vary. Okay, verse 3. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. As it may not surprise you, this verse 2 is fraught with translational difficulties. The word translated contend in the NIV has been variously understood. The Septuagint and the Vulgate suggest remain. And the New Revised Standard Version also does that, while the NASB is in agreement with the NIV's contend, which suggests strive. The word translated mortal is more literally flesh, in contrast to spirit. As after the sons of God event is recorded, the Lord comes to a conclusion about humanity. Depending on the translation of the word, contend or remain, the Lord announces either that the unending fight will not work, or that his spirit will not remain forever in human flesh. The first alternative is adopted by the NIV. The fact that humanity is flesh, NIV mortal, is a sign of weakness, both morally and physically. The Lord decides to stop fighting with a resistant humanity in Eden. So that's the thinking that if you subscribe to the view that the Hebrew word translated as strive or contend or is to be understood as strive. Alternatively, if we translate my spirit will not remain in humanity forever, the sense seems to be that he will remove his spirit and consequently humanity's flesh will die. The reference to 120 years would then most naturally refer to the successive shortening of the expected lifespan from slightly less than 1,000 years to a mere 120. Both of these readings are plausible. The author would contend he would favor for the second reading, since the last recorded death in the Pentateuch Moses occurs at 120 years, as we learn from Deuteronomy 34:7. Now we'll read about the Nephilim in verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Let's break that down a little bit and just look at the first part of that verse. Going back to where I was. Before here I saved it. The author's view is that the text does not say that the Nephilim are the children of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The meaning of the phrase and also afterward the punctuation of this verse is key to understanding it. The NIV punctuation seems to be suggesting the Nephilim were on the earth in those days when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. And in the first part B of that, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. The author's suggestion for punctuating that is the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. When the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. In this reading, Nephilim is not an ethnic designation, but a description of a particular type of individual. In Numbers 13:33, the only other time the Nephilim appear in the Pentateuch, they are identified along with the descendants of Anak as some of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. The latter are described as giants, but there is no necessary reason to consider the Nephilim to be giants. The problem with his reading of that is that it's kind of a skewed way many others look at that passage. I went online and did some reading about the other views about who the Nephilim were. It says the Nephilim are mysterious beings, people mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. They are large and strong. The word Nephilim is loosely translated as giants in some Bibles, but left untranslated in others. In fact, I think it's the King James Version that just says that they're kings, or that they're giants. And so they don't even translate the word Nephilim, they just insert the word giant. Some traditional Jewish explanations interpret them as fallen angels. The main reference to them is in Genesis. But the passage is ambiguous and the identity of the Nephilim is disputed. According to Numbers 13:33, they later inhabited Canaan at the time of the Israelite conquest of Canaan. A similar or identical biblical Hebrew term read as Nephilim by some scholars, whereas the word fallen by others appears in Ezekiel 32:27. So you have to think about that one a bit on your own, because there's certainly support for the view that the Nephilim were angels, fallen angels, giants, because they were in the flesh, and the view that they were powerful warrior beings that lived on the earth at the time that the sons of God and the daughters of men were hooking up, but that they were not necessarily giants. The original audience would understand that the great warrior figures that they were about to face in the land of Canaan were also present prior to the flood. The violent natures were part of the reason for the sending of the flood. Just as the Lord destroyed the Nephilim in the flood, so the Nephilim which Israel will face will likewise receive the judgment. The first year of the spies' description of the Nephilim and the sons of Anak resulted in an entire generation perishing in the wilderness. The children of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men were described as heroes of old, men of renown. The Nephilim are violent warrior figures that arise throughout history. They are paired with the violent children of the illicit union of the sons of God and the daughters of men to reinforce the theme of human violence as one of the principal reasons for the flood. The phrase men of renown is literally in Hebrew, men of the name. This becomes a theme linking the generation which perished in the flood to the generation of Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves, Genesis 11:4. They are deliberately contrasted with those who receive a name through God's promise. I will make your name great, Genesis 12:2. Those who achieve a name by their own efforts perish, and those who trust in God's promise to receive a great and lasting name do so through God's grace. Okay, now let's look at God's decision to send the flood, verses 5 through 13. Would someone like to read that, please?
God saw that the wickedness of men was great in the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth and grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. For it repented me that I have made him. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through it, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Okay.
Thank you. So in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. This text expresses in a powerful way just how pervasive and damaging human sinfulness can become. Humanity's wickedness had become great, and humanity's inmost thoughts were continually thoughts of evil. Now that's quite common, isn't it? There's just nothing good that could be said for man. It was all the time. It was everything he thought about, everything he proposed to do was evil. So, a powerful indictment of the state to which humanity had fallen. The flood starts the game over with a realistic understanding of just how difficult it will be for the Lord to see humankind fulfill the purposes of His without His intervention. Christians know that ultimately the intervention required was the incarnation of His divine Son. This text is the beginning of the Bible's explanation of why such drastic action is required. Verse 6. The Lord was grieved that He made man on the earth, and His heart was filled with pain. You know, if you look at the Old Testament, far be it to go as far as the New, just staying in the Old Testament. God's heart being filled with pain is not just expressed in this verse, but it's expressed in other times and places. Can you think of some of the other times that God had expressed this sentiment about feeling of pain when people didn't respond to Him in the Old Testament?
Well, the Israelites, Moses had to calm him down time,
Yeah,
so to speak,
yeah. Yeah, Moses had to intervene on behalf of
because
Israelites.
he wanted to get rid of them. Moses said, hold it back up.
You know, some of the prophets dealt with that pain when they were trying to, in their prophetic work, tell the people, listen, God is hurting over this. This is not just making Him angry. This is a tugging at His heartstrings. He can't understand you, why you would leave Him, why you would abandon Him the way that you have. This statement in Genesis 6 is often viewed as an anthropomorphism. That is, it speaks of God as though He were a human person in order for us to understand Him better. He gave God human characteristics. Human characteristic in the sense of pain and suffering. He was suffering in His spirit because of what man had become. And while we believe that He was, it helps us to understand that because we relate. We can understand what that feeling of being abandoned, that feeling of being put aside or not respected feels like. We know what that feels like, therefore we can understand it that way. God does not have the power to prevent humanity from making bad choices without turning us into puppets. He does, however, as the Creator, have the power to start over with His creation. You know, that's one of the things that Lynn and I in particular have talked about over the years is God's intention in making humanity the way He did. With us as people that can choose to obey or not. People that can choose to be His or not. To be people who align ourselves willingly with His willing way, God's intentions for us, or we don't. And you know, the sense is here in this passage that God has come to this point where He has decided that this original, and I can't use the word experiment because I don't think it was experimental, but this original incarnation, this design basis Rev Zero of mankind was not working out. So it finally reached a time in which they need to be punished.
I wonder what would make God think that it would turn out any differently or any better the second time around. You know, He saved Noah and Mrs. Noah and the 3 sons and their wives. But I don't think we're told that He did anything differently or whatever. I mean, we have a second chance here, but Shem, Ham, and Japheth maybe would do better. and Cain had done?
Yeah, and in fact, it's evident that they didn't do better. And
Well, here we are, you know?
yeah, they didn't do better. But it represented God's final attempt to work with man universally. You know, actually, it was the time leading up to Babel. After Babel, he began to work with Abraham, and he had extracted a line. In fact, that's part of where this whole series is going, that God chooses to start working with a family, as he sees that working with humanity overall isn't working. My contention is he knew that before he started. He needed for us to come to know that. That's my opinion. But I think he needed for man to know that too.
Well, I don't think that he was surprised and dismayed, you know, because we know that God knows everything. Time is nothing to him. He's all places and all times
Yeah.
that he wants to be at, so.
Yeah, he wasn't dismayed or said, well, wow, this is surprising to me. But it nonetheless was painful. You know, as he saw this worked out in the lives of individuals, I think this was very painful. As he saw that they didn't need to be this way. It wasn't what he wanted. And finally, it degenerated to the point that there really wasn't much good left. Verse 7, so the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. Same word shows up in verse 6 and 7, grieved. I'm grieved that I've made them. It hurts inside to think that these folks have turned out this way. The initial decision is to destroy mankind entirely and the rest of the infinite creation along with it. This suggests that in some fashion the destinies of humanity in creation are indissolubly linked, as in the account of the curses in chapter 3. Before I go on, what happened in chapter 3? There was
It's related to fruit.
pardon?
Was it the negative fruit?
Okay, guess right. The initial sin.
Yeah.
Sometimes called the fall of man. So what was the consequence to the animal or the plant kingdom? There were consequences to them too. Yeah. See, all those thorns and thistles, they hadn't been there before. So the whole world had been revolved around making things good for Adam and Eve. I mean, it was going to be good for them. This was neat. What they had received from God was this pleasant life experience. And instead, God said, okay, Adam, you're going to have to start hustling, wicked, because it's not going to be the same as it was. You're going to have to work by the sweat of your brow to earn your living. And thorns and thistles I've made for you, and they're going to be there. Maybe they were there before, but they certainly weren't there in the volume and in the number and destructiveness that were huge. So they were involved in the larger scale punishment. So here, God has involved the animals in being destroyed. That's why he had Noah build an ark and put animals in. It's because there was large scale destruction of the animal kingdom that was going to take place. So somehow that we're all tied together, this creation. suffers together. God's grief at having made humanity stems from having provided everything for the good of humanity, only to see them reject his good gifts and drift further and further away from his purposes for them. The divine pain at the sight of such grievous rebellion by his creatures he has made is an important biblical theme which leads ultimately to the cross. Verse 8. Thankfully, there's a little glimmer of good in this story. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. When it seems hopeless, seemingly out of nowhere, Noah is said to find favor in the eyes of the Lord.
Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, creation will not be totally erased. The Lord will begin again with the chosen person, a sort of new Adam. The Lord's grief at the violent human world is contrasted with his grace to a faithful man. The first time, reader breathes a sigh of relief. The Lord has not given up. We know from the rest of Scripture that he will never give us up. A commentator by the name of Rolf Rendorf has helpfully observed a parallel between the structure of the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11 and the Sinai story in Exodus 19 through 34. He argues that they show a parallel structure. In both cases, the first gift of God, the creation and then the covenant, is endangered by human sin and threatened to be destroyed by God's wrath. In both cases, God changes his mind because of the intervention of one man. It was Noah, and then it was Moses. In both cases, God promises not to bring destruction again on humanity or on Israel in order to confirm that he establishes his covenant. So that's an interesting parallelism there that exists between these stories where God was disappointed, but he chose not to act on his disappointment totally because there was the presence of a person. If you really think about this, Abraham, when he was negotiating with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, he started off with, I've got this large number of people. Would you destroy the city if I? No, I wouldn't destroy the city if you could find it. Of course, he couldn't find it. So he worked it all the way down. What was it, 5, something like that? 10. So he worked it all the way down, and ultimately, Abram couldn't find anybody. The trouble was that God was willing to intervene if he could find a remnant. If he could find just this person that chose to align themselves with him. In order to understand the flood narrative on its own terms, modern readers must learn to put their contemporary questions about the flood on the margins. The flood narrative is carefully crafted to emphasize the key point that after the appalling corruption which humanity had fallen into, the Lord decides to begin anew with new creation. The Garden of Eden had not worked as a strategy for sustaining the type of relationship which the Lord desires with the people he had created. Life east of Eden fared even worse. The escalating moral corruption and violence to which humanity degenerated brought the painful decision to begin anew. The structure of the flood narrative portrays the flood as decreation followed by recreation. But the recreation world, while similar in many ways to the world prior to its decreation, is also different. The post-diluvian world is the last universalistic divine strategy. God related to humanity as a whole in the garden and in the world east of Eden. But in both cases, the relationship became estranged by human rebellion. The flood functions theologically or ideologically as the last attempt by the Lord to relate to humanity as a whole on a universal basis. The fact that this third universal strategy also fails leads to the introduction of election, the divine choice of specific persons as the primary channel of the outworking of his purposes. The flood narrative demonstrates that God is not a God who will give up on his purposes. There is and will always be a Noah who finds grace in God's eyes. He is also a God who will not tolerate a world of violence and corruption. Humankind here in these verses are portrayed as prone to rebellion. Even the flood will not remove the tendency toward evil in the human heart, as a comparison of Genesis 6:5 and 8:21 makes clear, as does the story of the fall of Noah and his son Ham in Genesis 9:18 through 27. But even though the evil in the human heart has not been driven out by the flood, humanity is still the focus of God's redemptive and creative purposes. They are still the image of God and still have responsibility to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth in order to rule over it. The fact that the flood does not change human nature is striking. When God promises, in spite of this fact, never again to curse the ground on account of humanity, Genesis 8:21. There has obviously been a shift in the divine strategy. The destiny of the physical creation is no longer tied so directly to the destiny of humanity as it was previously. If future generations of humanity return to the violence and corruption which brought on divine judgment through a flood, there will be no flood. Instead, God will deal with the outbreak of human evil in other ways. The flood then functions as a sort of warning of the potential severity of God's judgment, as we see from Genesis 9:11. The relationship of humanity to the rest of creation is also changed in other ways after the flood. The diet of humanity had been limited, with possible exceptions for sacrifice and feasts, to a vegetarian one. After the flood, God allows humanity to eat animal flesh as food also. He protects the animal kingdom from being hunted into extinction by making them innately afraid of humans. He also limits human consumption of animals to those which are dead. They cannot be eaten with their life's blood still in them. Genesis 9:1-5. Genesis' flood story is a counter story. Israel was familiar with the polytheistic theories of the flood. Those stories were closely related to the creation myths, since creation was viewed as a sort of battle with the primordial chaos in the sea. Just as the creation account serves as an argument against polytheistic views, the same is true of the flood narrative. The following selection of differences within the ancient Near Eastern flood theories should make this come into clearer focus. First, in the biblical account, there is only one God, not a pantheon of gods in conflict with each other. Two, the God of the Bible is not frightened by the flood, as the gods of the flood stories are. In tablet 11, line 113 of the Gilgamesh epic, it reads, quote, "The gods were frightened by the deluge, and shrinking back, they ascended to the heaven of Anu. The gods covered and cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall." It's kind of like they were shaking in their boots. He alone, the God of the Bible, as he is alone is God, and he alone sends the flood. Third, the God of the Bible reluctantly and with a heavy heart sends the flood in order to eliminate the outbreak of human sin, violence, corruption. In the myths, the mythological gods send the flood because of the noise of humanity caused by its overpopulation. Remember, we commented on that in previous weeks. Fourth, in the myths, the hero is a king while Noah is an ordinary but godly person. Fifth, in the myths, after the flood, the hero is elevated to divine status, and his name is changed to Utnapishtim. Yes, Utnapishtim. In the Bible, Noah remains a human being and even lives to show his imperfections. Sixth, in the myths, the ark has no connection to reality. It is shaped as a cube and takes only 7 days to build. In the Bible, the ark has dimensions that reminds one of a boat, which could float and does not suggest an unimaginably short time for its building. Seventh, in the Bible, God shuts the ark in order to show that he is in control. In the myths, the hero shuts the ark. And then 8, God is the hero of the biblical flood story. He is in control. Noah obeys God but does not speak a single word during the entire narrative. By contrast, the hero of the myths is valorized and is made into a personage worthy of valor. His achievements are emphasized. He ultimately is made into a divine creature. While this is not intended to be an exhaustive listing of the differences between the flood stories of the ancient world and Genesis, these should make clear that Genesis is telling a counter story. Those stories portray the gods as competitive, political, greedy, ignorant, unreasonable, unreliable, fearful, petty, insecure, and unjust. They are no more moral, and sometimes less so, than the human beings they had created. Genesis portrays God as moral, just, righteous, holy, gracious, secure, fearless, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Israel, as they were about to enter the promised land, needed to know that God could be relied upon and that God would not tolerate a plague of human evil. You know, just from the standpoint of the encouragement it would have brought to them, considering the original audience to Genesis were the people who were living at the time that they were occupying Canaan. And it had to be encouraging to them to know that they worshiped a God who could make things happen like this, who could and would bring about punishment when punishment was necessary, and yet sustain and make possible the survival of his people. And as long as they were to do what they should do and what he asked them to do, he would sustain them and ensure their survival. So now we introduce Noah, verse 9. This is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God.
That's a pretty big deal.
Hmm.
So that's a pretty big deal. Walking with God,
Yes, very big deal.
you know.
Mhm. That's what
Enoch also, Enoch was the one who walked with God and was not because God took him.
Yeah. He'd been introduced in the previous section in the genealogy in chapter 5. Here he is given a moral and spiritual evaluation by the author. Noah was a man of righteousness in contrast to the corrupt and violent society in which he lived. Compared to them, he was blameless. Noah is the only person in Genesis described as blameless or perfect. Enoch was described as having walked with God, but only Noah was described as blameless. Abram is told to be perfect and walk before God, but he's never said to have achieved it. Noah is not only described by the narrator as a righteous man, God himself describes him so in chapter 7, verse 1. The word often describes the innocent in contrast with the guilty who are described as wicked. And then the author goes into what Clinton brought up about walking with God, reminds of the statement about Enoch in 5:23. The verb walked reminds the reader of the garden scene in chapter 3, verse 8. The same verb form occurs as the Lord's walking in the garden in the cool part of the day. Walk with God is to enjoy the same sort of direct and easy access to the Lord's presence as Adam and Eve had in the garden. Verse 10, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The sons of Noah are not listed in order of birth, but in order of significance in the story. Shem, the second son, the second born, is chosen by God. Ham, the youngest, plays a key role in chapter 9, verse 18 through 29. Japheth, apparently the oldest, is listed last. Verse 11.
Did you ring the bell?
Huh?
Did you ring the bell?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, one young person.
Okay, well, I'll pause there then. We'll resume next week at verse 11, chapter 6. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Appreciate that. Do we have any, okay. Who would like to lead here today? Lynn, would you like to do that? Thank you.
Let's pray. Dear Father, thank you for allowing us to come and worship you. There are several things we need to bring before the throne. Sacred Wallace, surgeries on August 6th, Katie Rice, Denver Helms, surgery is having surgery on July 16th. And Sarah Rhodes is dead. We just are so thankful that you sent your son to take on our sins so that we can have a home with him.
Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks for teaching.
You're welcome.
I love it. They don't do it easy. Pretty off. How about you? Okay.